There's a reason the most revealing moments in professional sports don't happen on the court. They happen after. When the final buzzer sounds and a team has just been gutted in front of thousands of people, the locker room doors open, the cameras roll, and suddenly there is nowhere left to hide. Press conferences after victories are performance. Everybody smiles, everybody shares credit, everybody talks about trusting the process and staying locked in. But press conferences after losses, those are something entirely different. Those are confessions. When the Indiana Fever walked off the floor following a 108-101 defeat at the hands of the Atlanta Dream, they weren't just carrying the weight of a loss. They were carrying the weight of a collapse. A collapse that happened in real time, in front of everyone, during the exact window of the game where championship teams assert their will and separate themselves from the competition. Instead, the Fever dissolved. And then Clark and Kelsey Mitchell sat in front of the microphones and told everyone exactly why. What they said wasn't vague. It wasn't the usual, we have to be better filler that fills post-game pressers from coast to coast. It was surgical. It was honest in a way that made you uncomfortable watching it. And if you knew how to listen, if you understood the language these players were speaking beneath the surface of their words, you'd realize that what came out of that press conference wasn't just a breakdown of one bad game. It was an indictment of an entire system. And it may have set the wheels in motion for something that changes the trajectory of this franchise entirely. This is where the story starts, not on the court, at the... To understand how completely the Fever fell apart, you have to go back to a very specific moment. 3 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Score tied at 95. Right there, that is the crossroads. That is the 180 seconds that separate franchises with rings from franchises with excuses. Every team in professional basketball knows what that window demands. You tighten every defensive rotation. You communicate through every screen. You make the opposing offense feel the pressure of a ticking clock and a defense that refuses to give them anything clean. You do not allow a secondary bench player to get comfortable. You do not allow transition baskets. You do not allow second-chance opportunities. You force the other team to grind out every single point against a wall of organized resistance. The Fever did none of that. Instead, they allowed the Atlanta Dream to shift into a completely different gear. The paint opened up like a highway. The guards lost their assignments. The rotations arrived late or didn't arrive at all. And the Dream, anchored by Angel Reese, whose rivalry with Clark has become one of the most talked-about storylines in the sport, took full advantage of every crack in the Fever's defensive shell. What had been a tight, competitive game suddenly became a controlled execution. Kelsey Mitchell sat at that podium and didn't sugarcoat it for a single second. She pointed directly to the structural failure that allowed it to happen. Too many players on the opposing roster got involved. Too many bench contributors found their rhythm at the worst possible moment. And the moment those secondary pieces got comfortable, the entire defensive blueprint fell apart. Mitchell called it shooting themselves in the foot. That is an honest phrase for what was actually a catastrophic abdication of defensive discipline in the game's most critical stretch. When you allow a team's bench rotation to feel at home against you during winning time, you have already lost the game. You've just extended the clock before the final score reflects. 60 points in the paint. Let that number sit for a moment. 60. That is not a number that comes from a team being slightly outplayed or catching a few unlucky bounces. 60 paint points is the result of a defense operating without coherent structure for sustained stretches of a game. It is a team that is not contesting drives, not protecting the rim, not communicating help-side coverage, and not forcing opponents to beat them with difficult, low-percentage looks from range. It is, simply, a layup line wearing professional jerseys. When a reporter raised that number in the press conference, the moment that followed told you everything about the character of the players in that room. Clark, a rookie point guard in only her first professional season, did not look for a way out. She did not redirect attention toward the front court. She did not look sideways at her teammates, searching for someone else to absorb the blame. She looked directly at herself and the other guards, and she laid it out plainly. The ball handlers were not picked up early enough. The backcourt failed to apply pressure at the point of attack, and that single failure at the very first line of defense triggered everything that came after. This matters enormously because in the geometry of modern basketball defense, the point of attack is where everything begins. When a ball handler pushes the pace off a rebound, off an inbound, off a make by the other team, the guard assigned to that ball handler must meet them immediately, must apply body pressure, must force the dribble left or right according to the scheme, must make the initial penetration feel costly. When that doesn't happen, when the guard is a half step behind or playing with no urgency, the ball handler steps into the paint with momentum on their side. Now the interior defenders have to react. They have to step up to cut off the drive. And the moment they do, they've abandoned their own assignments. The 90-degree cutter on the wing is now wide open. The strong side corner is vacated. The paint is populated by a helper who has left a shooter somewhere behind them. Every concession at the point of attack ripples outward and multiplies until the defensive structure doesn't look like a structure at all. It looks like chaos. And in those final 3 minutes, against Atlanta, the Fever gave the Dream 17 fast break points on top of all of it. 17. Those are points that come before the defense even has a chance to get set. Points that come from a team that can't get back, can't organize, can't recover. Points that come from mental lapses and broken transitions that compound every schematic failure already happening in the half-court. Add those together, and you don't have a basketball game anymore. You have a mathematical. What separates elite defenses from everything beneath them is almost never athleticism. It is almost never raw speed or physical dominance. What separates them is timing. Specifically, the ability to make the third correct decision in a sequence before the first two decisions have even fully resolved themselves. That is what the second rotation is. It is the read that comes after the help has already committed, the adjustment that keeps the defense whole even as it bends. Caitlin Clark described, with remarkable clarity, exactly how the Fever failed to make that read. When the Atlanta ball handlers beat the initial defender and forced the secondary help to step up, the Dream was not throwing the ball into a contested paint situation. They were throwing it to a cutter who had already sliced into the space that the help defender just vacated. A 90-degree cut. A 45-degree cut. Two movements that are as old as basketball itself, and just as deadly when the defense doesn't account for them. The 90-degree cut is deceptively simple. A player positions themselves on the wing, waits for the moment the ball penetrates, watches the help side defender step toward the drive, and then cuts hard toward the basket along the path that defender just left behind. If no one rotates to cover that cut, the pass is easy, the layup is uncontested, and 2 points appear on the scoreboard without a single difficult shot being taken. The 45-degree cut works the same principle from a different angle, typically from the top of the key or the slot, slicing diagonally into the paint as the defensive attention shifts elsewhere. Both cuts rely on the same assumption, that the defending team will fail to execute the third movement in the rotation sequence. And against the Fever, that assumption proved completely correct, over and over again. Clark said the second rotation simply didn't arrive. The tertiary help, the player responsible for tracking the cutter after the primary help has committed to the ball, stood still, ball watching, frozen, and the Atlanta forwards walked into the paint like they'd memorized the playbook in advance because the Fever's defensive breakdowns are not random. They are predictable. They are systemic. And sophisticated offensive coaches study and exploit them with great efficiency. When every single player on the opposing roster shoots over 50% from the field, you are not looking at a hot shooting night. You are looking at the diagnostic result of a defense that gave everyone open looks at the same time. That is an architectural failure. No single player caused that. No one missed assignment produces that number. That number comes from a system that is fundamentally misaligned with what it takes to defend at a professional. 4 words. Of everything said at that press conference, of all the admissions and breakdowns and diagnoses, 4 words carried the heaviest weight. Clark, mid-explanation, let them out almost casually, the way you mention something that everyone in the room already knows, but no one has said out loud yet. We went back to our old ways. The old ways. Those 3 additional words carry an entire history. They reference the version of this team that struggled through the early portion of the season, bleeding points through defensive indifference and rotational chaos, while Clark's offensive brilliance kept scores respectable enough to avoid complete embarrassment. They reference a defense that treated switching as a philosophy rather than a last resort, throwing mismatches at opponents and hoping that talent alone could compensate for the complete absence of disciplined scheme. They reference a team that was, for stretches, one of the worst defensive units in the entire league by measurable statistical standards. Head coach Stephanie White came into this season with a mandate to modernize the Fever's defensive identity. There were signs that the system was taking hold. A 4-game winning streak in the middle stretch of the season suggested real progress. The communication improved. The rotations arrived on time. The second and third movements in defensive sequences began to look like something coherent. And for those 4 games, the Fever looked like the team everyone believed this roster could be, when Clark was surrounded by a structure capable of protecting her offensive investment. But 4 games is not a habit. 4 games is a sample. And the moment the Fever faced adversity, faced a physical rival, faced a game where the defensive assignments became demanding, and the communication had to be perfect for 40 minutes, the structure evaporated. They reverted. They collapsed back into the patterns that define their worst stretches of basketball, and they did it in the most high-stakes window of the game. That is the most troubling part of this entire analysis. Not that the Fever played poorly in one game. Every team has bad games. The troubling part is that Clark's 4 words indicate that the improvement was never fully internalized. It was performance under favorable conditions, not genuine structural growth. The moment conditions became unfavorable, the team defaulted to familiarity. And familiarity, in this case, meant losing. The question that press conference quietly posed was this: is the coaching staff capable of making this team uncomfortable enough in practice to break those habits permanently? Because right now, all available evidence suggests the answer is. Kelsey Mitchell has been around professional basketball long enough to understand something that younger players sometimes take years to internalize. Offense is a gift. Defense is a decision. Offensively gifted teams can ride a hot shooting stretch for a quarter, maybe 2. They can carry a bad defensive night with a historically efficient offensive output and steal a win in spite of themselves. But you cannot build a winning organization on that foundation. You cannot design a championship run around the hope that your offense will always be good enough to outscore your mistakes on the other end. Mitchell said it plainly: defense must come first, not co-equal, not balanced. First, it is the foundation upon which everything else is built, and when it isn't there, the offense doesn't matter. This is a law that championship programs have understood across generations. The teams that win consistently are not always the most talented offensive units in their league. They are the teams that establish a defensive standard that never wavers, that hold that standard regardless of personnel, regardless of matchup difficulty, regardless of the score. They make you beat them. They do not give you anything. They do not allow you to run in transition. They do not allow your bench players to establish rhythm. They do not allow cutters to go unaccounted for because someone was watching the ball. Clark cannot carry this franchise with offense alone. That is not an insult. That is physics. She is already one of the most efficient offensive forces the league has seen at this level, and she is doing it as a rookie in her first professional season against fully developed veterans. The numbers she is producing are remarkable, but if the defensive scheme around her continues to operate the way it has operated in this loss, none of those offensive numbers ultimately matter, because the Fever will consistently allow opponents to score at a rate that neutralizes whatever Clark generates on the other end. Mitchell's mandate was simple and it was right. Value defense first. Not sometimes. Not when the matchup feels urgent. Every possession. Every rotation. Every cut that needs to be tracked. Every transition that needs to be stopped before it becomes 2 easy points. The margin for error in professional basketball is too thin for any other philosophy to survive contact. There is a specific kind of institutional alarm that activates when players begin publicly diagnosing the schematic failures of their own team at the podium. It is different from a player venting frustration. It is different from a player expressing disappointment. When a point guard breaks down the rotational mechanics of a defensive collapse in technical terms, in front of cameras, without being prompted to go that deep, it means the frustration has moved past the surface. It means the players have already had these conversations internally, and the answers they've received from the coaching staff have not been satisfactory. Clark is not an emotional responder. Watch how she operates throughout the press conference, and you notice the precision. She is not complaining. She is not emotional. She is clinical. She is describing the game the way a defensive coordinator might describe it during a film session, laying out the exact sequence of events that produce the outcome, identifying the precise moments where the structure broke down, and doing it publicly in a way that implicitly asks, why is this still happening? That is a question directed at the coaching staff. It is not the kind of question that gets asked out of nowhere. It is the kind of question that surfaces after repeated conversations in practice facilities, after film sessions where the same breakdowns are identified and the same corrections are supposedly installed, only to evaporate the moment the regular season returns and the lights come back on. The front office now faces a genuinely difficult situation. This is not a roster problem. The Fever have demonstrated, during their winning streak, that they are physically capable of executing a coherent defensive scheme. The talent is present. The athleticism is sufficient. The problem is the installation. The problem is the ability of the coaching staff to take what players are capable of executing in their best moments and make it the standard, not the exception. Reports and speculation across basketball circles suggest there is internal pressure building around the direction of this program. Whether that pressure translates into structural changes before this season concludes is something nobody outside the organization can say with certainty. But the public evidence is difficult to ignore. The players are telling you what's wrong. In detailed, technically sophisticated language, at the microphone, after the game. When that happens, the clock is already running. The Indiana Fever sit at one of the most genuinely fascinating crossroads in recent women's basketball history. On one side of the ledger, they possess something almost impossibly rare, a generational offensive talent in the first year of her professional career, already operating at a level that makes national sports media pay attention to a league they previously ignored. Clark has done something almost no rookie in any sport manages to do. She has made people care who did not care before. She has expanded the audience, elevated the conversation, and put the Fever on a stage they haven't occupied in years. On the other side of that same ledger sits a defensive system so fragile and so inconsistently executed that it consistently undermines everything the offense builds. The Fever can generate points. They have proven that repeatedly. What they cannot do, at least not yet, is protect a lead. Cannot preserve a defensive structure under pressure. Cannot make the second rotation when it matters most. Cannot keep a bench player uncomfortable. Cannot stop a cutter off a drive in the game's final 3 minutes. Those two things cannot coexist at the highest level for any sustained length of time. Eventually, one of them wins. Either the defense improves to match the offensive ceiling, or the offensive efficiency eventually becomes impossible to maintain against opponents who have figured out that all they need to do is run, slash, and shoot over 50%, because the Fever will not make them pay for any of it. Clark and Mitchell did something important at that podium. They refused to perform. They refused to give the generic answers that would have protected everyone in the building and let the coaching staff exhale. They told the truth. Technically, specifically, and publicly. And the truth they told was not flattering to the people responsible for the defensive scheme. Whether the Indiana Fever front office has the willingness to respond to that truth, to ask the hard questions of the people in charge of the system that keeps breaking down, to demand a level of accountability that matches what the players are already demanding of themselves, that remains to be seen. But the window is not open indefinitely. Rosters like this, built around generational offensive talents, do not remain patient forever. Players with options and careers to consider make decisions based on what they see around them. And right now, what they see is a team with enough.